The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library. Hello and welcome to Getting to Know You. Today's guests are Dr. Dorothy Cucinelli, CEO of Equinox, and Kathy Magee, she's Director of Domestic Violence Services for Equinox. We're going to be talking about their services, especially about the domestic violence part, and I'm really happy to welcome our CEO from Equinox, Dorothy Cucinelli.
Happy to be here.
And Kathy.
Hi.
Thank you for coming.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
Let's start with a little bit of an overview. I hear the word Equinox so often, and I've been confused my whole life about what you do, because I think you do so many things.
We do a lot of things in the community.
There's the Thanksgiving, which everybody always says first. We know that, but let's talk about overall.
Yeah, we are very well known for our Thanksgiving dinner. It is one of the longest running community dinners in the country, and we serve over 10,000 people a year at that dinner alone. So it's a really big deal, and we're very proud of it. But our unofficial sort of motto is we're more than just turkeys, because we do a lot more than the Thanksgiving dinner. The Thanksgiving dinner is really a small part of what we do. Our services are about 3 or 4 major areas. We do mental health services, so we have a broad range that covers everything from residential to an outpatient clinic. We're one of the largest outpatient mental health clinics in Albany County.
Now, I know you have properties for each of your services.
Yeah, we do. We have 11 different locations, all of them within Albany County. So the mental health services are in our main office at 500 Central Ave. We have a number of residential apartment buildings and group homes throughout Albany County. And the second major area that we have is substance abuse services. We have a very active substance abuse treatment clinic, which of course is very involved with the heroin epidemic that we've all heard so much about recently. In addition to that, we have youth services, which include the region's only runaway youth shelter for teenagers. Again, a very active program, unfortunately also very needed for kids who have no other place to go.
Are most of the kids local, or do they come from other cities?
Most of the kids come from within Albany County, although sometimes they come from farther away than that. It really is kind of surprising to me sometimes how kids make their way here from other places, and that's often because we're the only provider of that type of service around. So we do have the youth shelter. We also have what we call our youth outreach center, which is a place for kids to go. Again, teenagers, high school kids, middle-aged kids, middle school age kids after school. That's at our location at 95 Central Ave.
Perfect. It's right downtown.
Right. Great location for those kids, many of whom live in that area. And then finally, we have the domestic violence services, which include the shelter. We have the region's only, Albany County's only domestic violence shelter and non-shelter services, which Kathy's going to speak more about. And that's kind of the overview of everything that we do.
I want to go back to a couple things. One is the homeless children, or the runaways. How is it that they stay somewhere, they don't get taken back to their parents? Are they not wanted, or?
You know, kids can come to us for a variety of different reasons. Sometimes there's a situation where there's conflict at home for them, and that's probably the most typical situation. And kids feel that they have to get away from it. Sometimes it can be conflict with parents. It can be that it's an unsafe situation for them for whatever reason. You know, there can be drugs involved in the home. A lot of different situations can bring a kid to us.
And now you have a residential building for them.
Right. It's a short-term stay classification, which means the goal when a kid comes to us is that we try to reunite them with the family as quickly as we can. And in fact, that planning process begins almost from the moment they walk in the door. We want to have children back in their families. We work closely with the state and with the county to accomplish that, but our goal is to reunite them, but in a safe situation for them that's going to be, nurturing and give them what they need as young people.
It seems like there's a general theme to all your services. There are people who are in desperate need of help, basically.
Right.
And you've taken a fairly broad interpretation of your mission, which is wonderful because it encompasses between people who have chemical dependency and other fears about, or not just fears, but they're threatened in their homes.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation because actually the agency that we are today is the product of two agencies we actually merged 2 years ago. Clearview Center, which had the mental health services component of what we do now, merged with what was the predecessor Equinox organization, and that consisted of the domestic violence services, the youth services, and the counseling center. And what we discovered...
So Clearview brought the counseling center and the domestic violence center? The buildings?
Well, it was a merger, so
Okay.
it was a combining of the two organizations, fully legal process that we went through. It was a very long process. But what we discovered when we first started talking about formally combining the two agencies was that there really was a lot of overlap. There was a lot of complementarity of the services because, as you pointed out, we serve people who are really in desperate need for many reasons. But also the people in our agency often need more than one service. So, for example, we found that people who are in a domestic violence situation may need mental health counseling, for example, or, the reverse often happens. So our staff, we learned, knew each other a lot better than we realized they did, because they do these kind of cross referrals all the time. But that's just one kind of tangible example of how well the two agencies really meshed together before the merger. It's 2 years since we completed the merger at this point. It has been a process of assimilating both organizations, and we're, I think, a much stronger organization today than the two organizations were separately.
Now, one more kind of general question before we get into the domestic violence specifically. You seem to have a way to analyze the problem and try to come up with a solution. It's because you said it is short term. Could you talk a little bit about how you approach the treatment, I guess you might be able to call it?
Yeah. Well, all of our different treatment programs are licensed by the appropriate state agency. So for the mental health services, for example, they are licensed by the New York State Office of Mental Health. For the domestic violence services, they're regulated by the New York State Office of Children and Family Services. The counseling center would be OASAS, New York State OASAS. And so our approach in each of those areas mimics, or not mimics, but follows the best practice guidelines for each of those programs.
Okay.
And generally speaking, what we try to do in the treatment programs is meet the person where they're at, is the phrase. So you kind of work with where they are in their life and in their circumstances and move them to a better place. So, it's not a necessarily complete abstinence, for example, for someone who has substance abuse issues, but you try to get them to improve and get on the right path. And that's really what recovery is all about, getting on the right path and staying there. And we try to support people with that. And I would say that the domestic violence service philosophy is very much the same way. We work with the victims, and Kathy's going to speak more about that and much more eloquently than I can, but working with the victims to get them to where they want to be and help them make the changes that they want to make in their life. So we work with the individual to help them accomplish what they want to do.
Great. Let's move on then to domestic violence. Kathy, thank you.
You're welcome.
Tell us, I guess, an overview of the domestic violence program, the breadth of it, for example.
Well, Equinox is Albany County's comprehensive domestic violence services provider. So by that I mean that we help people from anonymous hotline callers to going into shelter, to people who have been in shelter or left an abusive situation and need some supports afterwards. And we help people at all stages of their domestic violence experience. So we get clients who come in or call, and they're in the midst of a situation they think might be abusive, and they're trying to sort that out. Am I in an abusive relationship? To people who are coming to us at court and saying they want an order of protection, or calling the police about a domestic violence incident and working with them through the criminal or the civil justice system, to counseling to gain some insight about how this happened, how to move ahead, what other issues come up as a result of the domestic violence, to transitional housing, which is after people are left domestic violence. After that, living permanently. And then another key part of our program is our shelter, which is a 30-bed shelter that's almost always full. And people, victims and their children come there to have a place to sort of sort out their options, be in a safe place, a confidential location, and they can figure out what the next steps are. So that temporarily removes them from active domestic violence.
It sounds like, from your point of view, it can be difficult to determine exactly how to talk to somebody. One person might not realize that even though they're hit, that they're a victim of domestic violence, and another person who maybe has a more subtle form could sincerely be confused about, is this abuse, or am I just an enabling person who's not standing up for myself?
That's very true, but we have this approach, like Dorothy said, about our other programs of meeting people where they are. So we don't have a regular script, and we don't have a specific way of taking them through the process. They define what they want in their goals. And so what we can do is provide information, plus the experience we've had of working with literally thousands of domestic violence survivors over the years, to let them know they're not alone. Because one of the elements of domestic violence is commonly that people feel very isolated, and they often feel a sense of blame about what the abuse is. A lot of times they've experienced emotional abuse and messages that everything is their fault. So when working with us, we can help sort that out, and so they can see a little bit more clearly that, no, it wasn't their fault that this happened, that they have been having a lot of control exerted over them by their abuser, and there are steps they can take to loosen that control or leave that control.
Let's come back to that, but maybe first define or talk about some of the varieties of situations that you have, the types of domestic violence that you deal with.
The most common domestic violence we deal with is partner abuse. So people who are living together, married, or possibly dating. And most commonly it's heterosexual abuse, but we work with people of all sexual orientations and all genders. So the people that we see could be female, could be male, could be gay, could be straight. We work with people as young as 16 and as old as in their 80s and 90s. So the spectrum is really broad in that. And the common element they experience is the power and control of another person over them. And that can be manifested through emotional abuse, financial abuse, physical abuse, psychological abuse, all of those kind of elements. Sometimes it's using children against you, or abusing pets, or stealing your money, all of those kind of things. Another population we work with, and are the only program in really in northeastern New York is around elder abuse. And that can be domestic violence where the parties have both gotten old, but the most common elder abuse we work with is adult children abusing their elder parents.
It seems unthinkable, but obviously it happens.
It does. A lot of times we find there's mental health issues involved with the adult child or substance abuse issues. Sometimes it's just a long time relationship, but there is a lot of manipulation that goes on of elders, and often these adult children are their caretakers. So there's a special relationship where the parent wants to protect their child and also depends on their child, and yet their child is exploiting them.
So how do you decide, how do you talk to people who really don't know whether they're being abused? That seems like an interesting situation, because I guess the stereotypical thing is the wife accepts it and won't leave and just thinks that this is the way life is, or that she's done something wrong.
I remember talking to a woman in our domestic violence shelter, and she said to me, "I'm not sure that I should be in this shelter. I don't know that I was really abused. My husband put a knife to my throat, but he didn't hurt me, actually. He just put it there and threatened. So maybe I shouldn't be taking this space." So I think that's how deep domestic violence and the guilt and the confusion that victims can have, that just because somebody threatens you, that maybe that's not abuse because you're not actually black and blue, you don't actually have blood running down your throat, but that's a terrifying situation. So in these situations, we try to emphasize the rights that the victim has, and part of that is the right to feel emotionally safe, and the right to control decisions. And we work with that very, very slowly and very tentatively with them. And of course, they have the right to make any decisions that they want. And we find with domestic violence and with elder abuse, which is a component of domestic violence, that often it takes many times for somebody to try to disengage from the abuser or have a different kind of relationship, because these relationships are generally based on love, hope, great hope. And what we hear over and over are victims saying, "I just want the abuse to stop," or "I just want him to get counseling so this won't happen anymore, but I want the relationship." So the work that we do is often education and support while they go through the process to determine whether or not that can actually happen.
Let's look at the elder abuse again, just for a moment. I was fascinated by some of the variety of ways that elder people can be abused. When I first thought of the concept, when I saw it on your website, I thought, well, what would that be? And I'm thinking they were just talking to them poorly or not taking care of them, but there can be a lot of other things.
Oh, yes. Many of the elders that we work with, probably most of them, have some sort of physical disability. And so they are limited in some way. Maybe they can't drive. And so a form of abuse is just keeping them isolated from other people. And isolation is a terrible thing psychologically to people, to not be able to have other people around. Sometimes the abuse is if they need medications, or they're in a wheelchair, or have some sort of mobility issue, is not taking care of that need. Sometimes it's been not feeding people adequately, and a lot of times it's stealing money from their bank accounts.
Yeah, those are three really big things, and I think that, in a way, the biggest emotional impact that I had of what you said was the aloneness, that suddenly they're like a plant, right?
Yes.
And the children feel like, well, I fed them, I watered them, what else do they need?
I heard a radio story today about plants, and they apparently can hear things too. So, yes, people need other people for contact, and they need love, and they need care. And when they're in a chaotic environment, it's very, very challenging. And when they're ignored or their friends are actively kept away, because that's one of the things that happens so often with domestic violence is the other people who could give you a reality check, they're driven away. And that reminds me of another woman that we worked with who worked for the state. And so she was in a busy office, and every day her husband came and took her to lunch. And her office mates were a little jealous because of the attention that this man was giving her. Every day he would come over, they'd go off for lunch, and he'd pick her up after work. Then there came a time when she announced to her coworkers that she had separated from her husband, and she told them that he was controlling her communications at all times, that he was coming to work every day to make sure that she wasn't chatting and being friends with somebody else, that he was picking her up to make sure she didn't go anywhere else. So she had no social life outside of him, and what would look to the outside world like very attentive, loving behavior was actually very controlling behavior.
That's pretty awful.
Yeah.
So you have buildings, and obviously you have a limit to how many people. How difficult is it for you to try to manage the places? Either of you might want to answer that.
Yeah, we do have a lot of locations. As I said, we have 11 different locations, so there's a lot of real estate involved. And it is a challenge. We have different programs in different locations, as Kathy said. The shelter, which is in a confidential location, is just one of them, but that particular shelter is full almost every day of the year, and we're not talking just about the victims of domestic violence. We house the children who may come with the victim as well, and that's a pretty frequent occurrence. I should mention, too, pets here, because I think they're important in the domestic violence picture. A lot of times an abuser will abuse a pet, or they will, exert control over the victim through the pet. And that will cause some people to remain in an abusive situation because they're afraid of what will happen to the pet if they leave. And because of that, we've set up a partnership with the Mohawk Hudson Humane Society, where they will take a pet when a person goes into shelter and care for that pet. And
really, I just saw about that on the news, I think yesterday.
Yeah.
Brad Shear was on talking about something like that.
Yep, it probably was our program.
It's wonderful.
It is wonderful, because that's often, without that, people would remain in those abusive situations.
But they still lost the pet, so that's still troubling.
Well, they don't lose the pet. The pet is cared for. It's kind of like putting it in extended daycare.
Okay.
So they care for the pet, and then when the victim is ready to move wherever they're going to move, the Humane Society, releases the pet back to them. So they care for the pet in the interim. We're not set up in the shelter to care for animals, and so it really works out very well for us.
But people who are in the shelter who are using this service go and visit the pets frequently. So we make arrangements so that can happen. And meanwhile, the pet is getting good veterinary care, getting up to date with the shots and all of that. And that really has been a barrier for people.
I see. I was a little confused because I thought that you took the pet out of the house but left the elder.
No.
Okay. So let's kind of go one step further. You have to help people get better. So once you've determined, okay, I kind of understand the case, we're taking it where it is, how do you do that? What tools do you have to work with somebody once you've entered into a deeper relationship with them and kind of understand what's going on?
I suspect this is similar with all of our programs because we confront that issue with every kind of service that we have. And one of them is you can't drag somebody to get them to be in a better place. Ultimately, it has to be their decision because they're going to have to live that the rest of their life. So what you can do is provide information, you can provide inspiration, you can provide a lot of empathy and a lot of resources. And then by all of those techniques, you gently lead them as much as they can go to towards the direction they have defined as wanting. And so we don't, in any of our programs, we're not coercive. We can't be because these people are going to live with themselves 24 hours a day and we're not.
Right.
And so ultimately we're trying to do things that will help them feel better for the rest of their lifetime, not help us feel better that we solved a problem.
Right.
So specifically for some of our programs, just to make that a little bit more, to put a face on it, that may mean that we help a domestic violence victim find other housing, for example, and then we would continue to have our staff do ongoing counseling with them and check in with them, periodically.
Right.
So continued support. For a mental health client, for example, that may mean that we have them engaged in our day treatment program, that they're coming for services every day, that they're agreeing to take medication. They may choose to live in one of our residences where they have staff support 24/7, and then eventually they would move to their own apartment where they need less supervision. They're able to live independently. They can go and seek a job, further their education, whatever their personal goals may be. So that's where that's how we kind of define meeting the person but helping them move on.
And that's really where you get the satisfaction, when you can manage that whole process.
Well, we don't think of it as managing so much as partnering with a person, because we're, as Kathy said, we're not in charge. We are the experts in what we do. We know the established practices and what works better than what doesn't. And we can certainly inform people about that, but ultimately the decision about what a person wants to do about their own care, their living situation, their relationships, all of that is really up to the individual.
So there's a lot of coaching and helping and
a lot of coaching.
Social
Yep.
interaction.
Absolutely.
We see on TV probably the most traumatic things, and we see the case where the person is put back into the relationship temporarily because they think that they want to try again, and let's say the husband in this case agrees to go to counseling, but that's all up front, and it falls apart, of course, because they haven't really changed. But in reality, you deal with the everyday case. Could you put a little perspective on that? It's not like every woman that goes back gets murdered. I mean, what I'm getting at is how realistic is the picture many of us have from what we see on TV?
The media, I think, for good or for bad, sometimes picks up on the most extreme cases. There are elements of those extreme cases that we do see. We do see situations where, and I'm not talking just about domestic violence, I'm talking about, people who are heroin abusers, for example, who may be in a situation that has become life-threatening to them. They've become involved in a gang, because they need to get money to support their habit, they overdose and they nearly die. I mean, you hear about that sort of thing in the media, but those are the situations that we actually see on a fairly regular basis. Now, is that every person who comes in? Certainly not. There's a range. We do see some of those more extreme cases, but we see, some of the not so extreme cases as well. The person who may have gotten their first DWI and they're referred to us, for substance abuse counseling. Do they even recognize they have an alcohol problem? Many people that come to us say they don't. Well, clearly you do if you got arrested for it, So it really is a spectrum, and the same would apply for domestic violence. there are ranges. There are people who come to us and, they need to be receiving medical care in a hospital because they're badly beaten up physically, absolutely emotionally, but some who are not quite there. It's a range.
So all of this takes a lot of money.
Yes.
How do you manage that?
Well, it's a challenge. Any executive in the not-for-profit field these days will tell you that funding is probably the #1 challenge we face. There have been, as we all know, cutbacks in government funding for programs, not just for us, but for many other types of services that government has traditionally funded. And that continues to be a struggle for us. We rely on a number of different funding sources. Certainly, philanthropy from the community is one of them. It is very, very much appreciated, and it's a critical component of putting the whole picture together financially for us. We rely also on other sources of funding, government grants that fund particular services, insurance that covers the more visit-based types like the clinic, the mental health clinic that I mentioned, the counseling center, those sorts of things, private grants. It's really a very complex funding mix, probably more complex than your typical for-profit business,
Right.
I would say.
Does that make it easier or more difficult? Because sometimes with a lot of funding streams, you'll have a problem with one more than another, so at least we're not faced with losing Equinox because of one thing happening. I don't know if that
Right.
makes sense.
Yeah, it does. The diversity of different funding, I think, gives us some degree of flexibility and some degree of stability, but at the same time, it's kind of like that game where you're always whacking, the whack-a-mole game. Whichever funding stream is kind of popping up as an issue is the
You
one
have to
that
work
needs to
on.
be addressed, and there's always something. Grants are great, but they are not permanent, so there's always a constant grant reapplication process that's going on at any given time. Funding is changing, the mental health field, the counseling field, healthcare in general, because of the Affordable Care Act, but also because of a lot of initiatives that are going on at the state level, is undergoing massive transformation right now, and Equinox is very heavily involved in the discussions to shape the future going on. So that will change the type of service we deliver to some degree, but it will certainly also change the funding, and that is a challenge that we are encountering right now as well.
What can viewers do if they want to help?
Well, they can certainly donate. We always accept donations. Our development office is happy to speak to people. We're happy to give out more information to people who might be interested but not sure that they want to support us. We're certainly grateful to the people in the community who have been longtime and continued donors for many, many years. We have some people in the community who've been our supporters for 20 years or more. And we're very happy to have them, whether it's $5 or $50,000. We're happy. We certainly like the $50,000, but really it's the everyday donors who
That
contribute
make
to
a
our
difference.
cause that really can make a difference. And I think for a donor, the thing that makes us unique is that you know that your dollars are going to support the direct care of people who really need it. These are not. These are people in very desperate circumstances that, as Kathy has described and as I've tried to describe a little bit too here. These are not people who are able to take advantage of a lot of other resources. They're really, at very low points in their life, and donors who support that really understand that, I think, and there's a certain satisfaction in knowing that you're helping at that very basic level.
So you want to tell people your website and phone number?
Sure. Our website is www.equinoxinc. You have to put that Inc. in there.
INC.
inc.org, and there's a lot of information on our website. There's links to other articles about us that I think are very informative, but it describes all of our services. There's a calendar there. With the Thanksgiving dinner, there's also a link to the T-Day sign-up, and I'll just read you the number there. The T-Day hotline is 434-0131, and again, 434-0131 for anyone who wants to volunteer to help out, whether it be, drive and deliver meals on Thanksgiving Day, help us cook, help man the sign-in booth, whatever you want to do, clean up. We always need a lot of people to help clean up. or you're requesting a meal for someone, yourself, someone in your family, whatever it may be, that's the number to call.
And I want to do one more question because you're really here to help people. Help people get an idea about when they should call. Sometimes people might not feel comfortable calling.
For the Thanksgiving?
No,
dinner,
for anything, for their service. Let's say they might feel abused. Could they call the same number? How do they reach you?
Yes, well, the domestic violence hotline, which is 24 hours a day staffed, is 432-7865. And I would say that with working with any of the populations we have, if people are wondering about something, they should reach out and talk, because we're not diagnosing people the first time they call. We're not prescribing what it is to do. So a lot of the services we have in domestic violence, but also the rest of the agency, is answering questions. And on the domestic violence hotline, you can be anonymous. You can just call and start talking. And a lot of people do start their relationship with us that way. Sometimes it doesn't even go any further than that, but they've been provided some resources and they've talked to somebody who's listened and understood.
And I should say, when someone makes that call, it could be helpful to understand that they're not the first person making that call. There are a lot of people who call that hotline every day. We get nearly 2,000 phone calls a year. So, you're not going to sort of stick out as the person who called the hotline today. And there are very experienced, compassionate people answering that phone line. These are not volunteers. These are staff who are very well trained in their field. They're experts. They know what they're doing. And their goal is to help the caller. So we really hope that if people feel that they're in a situation where they want to reach out, that, pick up the phone and call us. We're
Right.
there.
Dorothy and Kathy, I want to thank you very much for what you do and also for being on our show today.
My pleasure.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
And I want to thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the show, that you tune in again next time, and that you have a great week. Take care.